So we saw in our last video that Tocqueville, in his memoir on pauperism, argues that by a universal law of the growth of civilizations and society and their prosperity, that the higher the standard of living, the higher the distribution of general prosperity in a society, the more you increase the likelihood of having a permanently dependent, impoverished class. And we saw the reasons for that being that you both increase the needs themselves by raising the standard of living and also increase the class that itself is in this precarious position of supplying and living totally dependent on secondary needs and markets for them. So now the question is, how does a civilized and prosperous society with more than enough to supply everybody solve this problem? And you have two choices, don't you? You have either public support, what he calls public charity, or you have private charity. Those kinds of charities or things that are dependent not on the government, but on individuals and their own free benevolence. And he's going to argue that even though it seems that a society that is prosperous should pool its resources together, say in the form of taxes, to then provide a less precarious type of social support, let's call that permanent public charity, or welfare for short, he's going to argue that such a solution is a false solution, one that actually perpetuates poverty and creates a permanent underclass rather than alleviating the problem and eliminating or reducing it. So what are his arguments? In this video, we're going to look at his general philosophical argument from human nature. In our next video, we'll look at how people might object to that and talk about practical solutions that can be offered to fix a welfare, to reform welfare, you might say. And then what we'll do is we'll look at his arguments as to why public charity like this, welfare, actually increases the conflict in society and also decreases the morality of the impoverished class and therefore decreases their likelihood of ever getting out of their condition. So what are humans like? We see throughout this course that this is one of the most important questions that are involved in specific questions of money and how it should be spent and prosperity and whether it's good or bad for you. And so we saw that Marx and people like Nietzsche and Marx all talk about this universal human desire to achieve, to increase their condition, to improve themselves, to go beyond themselves. And Tocqueville thinks that while there are a few people like this, most people aren't like this at all. Most humans are, and here he would say all humans, are motivated by what he would call the pleasure motive. He says that we have this universal passion for idleness. And what he means by idleness is, look, I don't want to work. Working is hard. So that's why we have TGIF, right? Thank God it's Friday. And this is why the Fritzes all sing about living for the weekend. Because when I'm working, I'm not having fun. But all of us have this universal desire to stop working, to be able to take a rest, and have fun. And this is universal, he says. So then why do we work? Isn't that a good question? If we have this universal desire to escape work, then why work? Well, you might say that the reason why we work can be divided into two different motives, he says. One that motivates the majority, and is the only one that motivates the majority, and one that a few have, but not enough. So the universal one is, look, if I don't work, I don't eat. If I don't work, I can't survive. I can't support myself, I can't support my family, I can't support the lifestyle that I'm used to. And so look, I better work, and I even better go to work on the weekends sometimes, like I'm doing right now. So that what? So that I can put some bread and butter on the table. So that I can actually rest every once in a while. And he says this is what motivates the majority of us. And this is probably the only motive that motivates the majority. He says, if you're honest. Somebody like Marx, he would say, has two idealistic a view of human nature. They think that all of us desire to work and take joy in work, and he says, no, most of us just feel forced to. And what forces us to is that if we don't, we're not going to eat. So now, there is a second motive that some of us have in reality. Maybe most of us have in lip service, but some of us have in reality, he says, and that is self-improvement, to improve my condition, to become rich, maybe, to become more honorable, to become a better person, a more glorious, great human being. But he's saying that's true, but only for a minority. So now what happens when you have public charity? Now this is the crucial thing. He's talking about a permanent kind of charity that there are no conditions for. Okay? And he's going to argue later on that this is really the only feasible kind of charity that the government could run anyway, is this permanent, institutionalized, administrative kind of charity, which we call welfare in our modern times. And he says, so let's say someone becomes impoverished and they need welfare. They're out of a job. Well, now they get this free money, don't they? They get this free support. And if the support's going to work, it's got to be able to support them, doesn't it? It's got to give them enough to survive. Which means that it eliminates the one motive that motivates people to work for the majority of people. Thus, the only incentive in most of us is eliminated when welfare is institutionalized. So let's say that I'm this person who's like that, has no motivation to improve. I just want enough that I can live, and once I have that and I don't have to work, then look, the one thing that motivates me is still going on. I can have fun and I don't have to work. So why get a job? Why move out of this condition when someone else is supporting me? Those of you who have children know what I'm talking about. As they get older, the one thing you want to do is kick them out of the house. Why? Because if they get old enough to realize that you are rich enough to continue to support them without them getting a job, a lot of them will stay home, play video games, and watch TV. And so you have to give them motivation, which means fire under their butt, which means no public welfare. So, thus he argues that when you institutionalize charity like this, when you have public welfare, you actually create a permanent kind of structure that won't go away. Because for the most people who are poor, he says, be honest, most people who are poor are the least industrious. And therefore what you have, those who are rich, are the most industrious. And he's not talking about rich people alone, especially in our country. He'd be talking mostly about the high middle class. In other words, the ones who are not so rich that they can avoid paying taxes. So thus the tax burden falls on those who are least able to afford to do it. And they're the most industrious. And therefore the most industrious end up supporting the least industrious and creating a permanent kind of dependent structure precisely because they've eliminated in this structure the one incentive to improve, or at least the one incentive to get out of poverty. So in our next video, we're going to answer objections to this. You might say, here are the two main objections. One, well then why don't we make charity dependent on whether you deserve it or not? In other words, some people are poor because they don't work, and they shouldn't get that. The government should not give it to them. And other people are poor because they can't avoid it. These are the people who we should support, you might argue. And then the second objection is, and as far as those who are able-bodied, we should put them to work. And we're going to see why Montesquieu says such a system could never be run by a government, at least on this earth, anyway.